He sat by his hearth, the firelight. He sat by his hearth, the firelight casting his immense shadow against the rough-hewn log walls of the cabin. The flames painted his long, tangled beard and hair in shades of amber and rust. Outside, the world had been erased by a blizzard that had screamed for 2 days straight, a white fury that had buried the landscape and every trail he had ever cut. He was a man built of the mountain itself, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle earned from a life of grappling with granite and timber. His solitude was a fortress, its walls built from years of deliberate isolation, and the storm was just another guard on patrol. He shifted, the simple movement causing the floorboards to creak a complaint. He had built this place with his own 2 hands, each log notched and settled with a brutal patience. It was a testament to his will to be apart from the world of men below. Then, through the howl of the gale, another sound came. It was sharp, unnatural, a crack that was not wood, followed by a thin, desperate cry that the snow tried and failed to completely smother. It was the sound of life in distress, a note of discord in the storm's monolithic symphony. He stilled, his head cocked, listening. Animals cried out when trapped or wounded, but this held a distinctly human timbre of panic. For a long moment he did nothing. The code of the high peaks was simple. The mountain decided who survived. To interfere was to invite complication, to tether oneself to a fate that was not one's own. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks onto the stone hearth, and in their brief, frantic light he saw the faint reflection of his own face in a small pane of glass, a face weathered into a mask of grim endurance. Another cry, weaker this time, pricked at the edges of his consciousness. It was a sound that did not belong in his world of stone, snow, and silence. It was the sound of the world below, clawing its way up to his doorstep. With a low grunt of resignation, he pushed himself to his feet, his form seeming to fill the small cabin, a giant disturbed from his slumber. The fortress of his solitude had just been breached. He pulled on the heavy layers of hide and fur that served as his armor against the cold. Each piece was a memory of a successful hunt, a testament to his dominance over the wild things that shared his domain. Opening the cabin door was a battle in itself. A wall of new snow slumped inward, and the wind tore at him, a physical blow of ice and fury. He leaned into it, his sheer mass the only thing keeping him anchored. The world outside was a churning vortex of white. Visibility was less than an arm's length, the air so thick with driven snow it was like breathing ice dust. He relied on a deeper sense of geography, the memory of every rock and tree etched into his mind. He moved toward the sound he had heard, a slow, powerful trudge through drifts that came up to his waist. The cold was a living predator, sinking its teeth into any exposed inch of flesh, but it was a beast he had fought and tamed 1,000 times. He found the source of the sound near a precipice, where a horse, its leg bent at an impossible angle, had already succumbed to the cold, its form a dark, tragic mound against the snow. And a few feet from it, half buried in a fresh drift, was a splash of impossible color. It was a patch of white fabric, a stark, clean white that had no place in the grim palette of the wilderness. He dug at the snow with his gloved hands, his movements urgent. He uncovered a figure, small and still. A woman. She was dressed in a thin white prairie dress, a garment of shocking impracticality for this brutal environment. It was the attire of a town, of a life of warmth and ease, now frozen stiff around her limbs. Her face was the color of porcelain, her lips a deep, alarming blue. Black hair was fanned out against the snow, stark and beautiful. He knelt, his huge frame casting a temporary shield against the wind. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, a thread so faint it was almost imperceptible, a fragile bird's heartbeat fluttering against the coming void. He hesitated for only a second. This was the complication he had dreaded. A life, fragile and foreign, now placed directly in his hands. Leaving her was a death sentence. Saving her meant shattering the quiet order of his existence. He looked at her still face, at the fringe of ice clinging to her eyelashes. There was no real choice. The moral compass buried deep beneath the hardened survivor pointed in only one direction. With a grunt, he slid his arms beneath her, one under her knees, the other supporting her back, and lifted. She was shockingly light, a bundle of cold fabric and brittle bones that felt as if she might break in his grasp. He turned his back to the wind and began the arduous journey back to the cabin, carrying the world below in his arms. The warmth of the cabin was a physical shock, a thick blanket of heat that made the cold clinging to them feel even more vicious. Jedediah moved with a practiced economy, his focus absolute. He laid her on the thick bear pelt before the hearth, close enough to feel the radiant heat, but not so close as to be harmed by the flames. Her white dress was frozen solid in places, a shell of ice and fabric. He worked carefully, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly deft as he unfastened the tiny buttons at her throat, his breath pluming in the air. He peeled the frozen layers away, revealing the pale skin beneath, and wrapped her shivering form in the driest, warmest furs he owned. He worked without sentiment, his actions driven by the singular purpose of survival. He was a physician of the wild, and his patient was hovering on the edge. He brewed a thin broth from dried meat and herbs, the savory scent filling the small space, a promise of life and sustenance. For hours she did not stir. He sat in his usual spot, watching her, his stoicism a mask for a deep, unsettling curiosity. She was an anomaly, a question mark laid upon his predictable existence. Who was she? What series of disastrous choices had led her here, dressed for a summer picnic in the heart of a winter apocalypse? As the firelight danced across her features, a flicker of life returned. Her eyelids fluttered. Then they opened. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and in their depths he saw not just fear, but a sharp, cutting intelligence that was instantly on guard. She tried to sit up, a gasp escaping her lips as the movement sent a jolt of pain through her chilled body. Easy. His voice was a low rumble, a sound more akin to shifting rock than human speech. He held out a wooden bowl of the steaming broth. Drink this. It will help. She stared at him, her gaze taking in his immense size, the wildness of his hair and beard, the raw power that seemed to radiate from him. She was a cornered animal, assessing a predator. But his eyes, though intense, held no malice. They were calm, steady, and weary. She reached out a trembling hand and took the bowl, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was brief, but it sent a strange current through him. He was not used to touch. He watched as she drank, her throat working. The simple act seemed to exhaust her, but a faint touch of color returned to her cheeks. She sank back into the furs, her dark eyes never leaving his face. The cabin, his sanctuary, now felt impossibly small, charged with the presence of this stranger. It was no longer just his space. It was a shared refuge and a potential prison. Days bled into one another, trapped within the four walls of the cabin as the blizzard raged without ceasing. The world outside was a howling white emptiness, sealing them together in an enforced intimacy. The silence between them was thick at first, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind. He tended to her needs with a quiet efficiency, offering food and water, adding logs to the fire. He moved about the cabin with the quiet grace of a large animal in its own territory, while she watched him from her cocoon of furs. On the third day, The storm's fury lessened to a relentless, heavy snowfall. The silence inside grew louder. "Jedediah," he said, his voice startling in the quiet. He was looking into the fire, not at her, giving her the space to refuse an answer. She was quiet for a long moment, and he thought she would not reply. "Leanne," she finally said, her voice soft but clear. The name felt foreign on the air of the cabin, delicate and strange. Piece by piece, a fractured story emerged, told in clipped, hesitant sentences. She had been on horseback trying to reach the town of Three Forks, more than a day's ride below. The storm had come on too fast. The horse had slipped on a patch of ice near the ridge, its legs snapping with a sound she would never forget. She spoke of the cold, the creeping numbness, the despair. She did not say why she was running, and he did not ask. Prying was a violation of the mountain's code of privacy. He respected the borders of a person's pain. He learned more from watching her than from her words. As her strength returned, she refused to remain idle. She would neatly fold the furs she had slept in, her movements precise and graceful. She insisted on helping prepare their meager meals, her delicate hands, which he had first thought useless, proving to be quick and capable. There was an iron will beneath the fragile exterior, a resilience that impressed him. He found himself observing the way the firelight caught in her dark hair, the determined set of her jaw as she concentrated on a simple task. A strange warmth, entirely separate from the hearth, began to unthaw something frozen deep within him. One evening, as she was stirring a pot of stew, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "You are a good cook, for a mountain," she murmured, a hint of gentle teasing in her tone. He grunted, a sound that was his version of a chuckle. "Survival requires it." Their eyes met across the flickering light, and in that shared glance a new understanding passed between them. The mistrust was dissolving, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning respect. He was no longer just her rescuer, and she was no longer just a burden. They were two souls weathered by different storms, finding a moment of calm in the eye of this one. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world of stunning, brutal beauty. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, and the sun cast a blinding glare across a landscape buried in pristine snow. The silence was absolute, a profound quiet that felt heavier than the storm's roar. Jedediah strapped on his snowshoes and ventured out, his breath crystallizing in the frigid air. He needed to check his trap lines, to reassert his rhythm with the land. From a high ridge that overlooked the sprawling valley below, he scanned the horizon. The world was a blanket of unbroken white, except for 3 dark specks moving at the distant tree line. Riders. They moved with purpose, their dark coats stark against the snow. Even from this distance he could feel their intent. He squinted, his eyes sharp from years of tracking game. He recognized the brand on the lead horse as it turned, the sun glinting off the saddle's silver concho. The Double Crown. It was the mark of the largest ranch in the territory, a vast empire of cattle and land whose owner had passed away in the autumn. Jedediah knew of the man who ran it now, the foreman, a man named Sterling. He was known in the valley for his ambition, a sharp-edged man who carved his way through the world with little regard for who he cut. A cold knot formed in Jedediah's gut. These were not lost travelers. They were not a rescue party. Their formation was that of a hunting party, fanned out and sweeping the foothills. They were searching for something. Or someone. He thought of Leanne, of her desperate flight to Three Forks, of the fear in her eyes that had not entirely faded. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the mountain air, that they were hunting her. He immediately abandoned his traps and turned back toward the cabin, his long strides eating up the distance. The peace of the morning had been a lie. The storm from the world of men had not passed. It had only been waiting for the snow to clear. His sanctuary was about to become a battleground. He reached the cabin, his movements tight with urgency. He didn't need to say a word. Leanne saw the grim set of his jaw and the hardness in his eyes. "They are here," she stated, her voice barely a whisper. All the color drained from her face. "Riders from the Double Crown," Jedediah confirmed, his voice a low growl as he barred the heavy wooden door. "3 of them." Panic flared in Leanne's eyes, bright and hot, but it was swiftly banked by that core of iron he had come to recognize. "He found my horse," she breathed, her mind racing. "Sterling. He would have tracked me from there." She looked around the small cabin, a cage with only one exit. "You have to hide me, Jedediah. Please." He gave a curt, decisive nod. There was no question of turning her over. She was under his protection now. That was a law more absolute than any written in a town. He kicked aside a bearskin rug, revealing a dark, square outline in the floorboards. He pried it open with his fingers, exposing a small, dark space beneath, a root cellar, cool and smelling of earth and dried herbs. "In here. Be silent, no matter what you hear." She didn't hesitate, lowering herself into the cramped darkness. Her eyes, wide and dark, looked up at him one last time before he fitted the heavy wooden trap door back into place, sliding the rug over it to conceal the seams. He had barely straightened up when a voice hailed from outside, sharp and arrogant. "Ho, the cabin! Anyone home?" Jedediah took a deep, steadying breath and unbarred the door, stepping out to block the entrance. His massive frame filled the doorway completely, a wall of muscle and grizzled defiance. 3 men sat on horseback, their figures casting long, dark shadows on the snow. The man in the lead, Sterling, dismounted with a fluid motion. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way, his clothes expensive and his smirk condescending. His eyes flickered over Jedediah, taking in his size with a flicker of assessment before dismissing him as a savage. "Quite the hovel you've got here, mountain man," Sterling said, his tone dripping with disdain. Jedediah remained silent, his face an unreadable mask of stone. His stillness was more intimidating than any threat. "I'm looking for someone," Sterling continued, his gaze sweeping past Jedediah, trying to peer into the cabin's shadowed interior. "A woman. Slipped away from us in the storm. Small thing, Chinese, wearing a white dress. You wouldn't have seen a stray lamb like that wander up this high, would you?" Jedediah's eyes were flat and cold as glacial ice. "The storm was bad," he rumbled. "Nothing alive came through it." Sterling's smirk tightened. He took a step closer, invading Jedediah's space. "Is that so? Funny, we found a dead horse down the ridge. Looked like it fell recently. And I see 2 sets of tracks in the snow around this cabin, and one set is mighty small." The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken violence. Sterling's gaze was fixed on the cabin's chimney, from which a steady plume of smoke rose. "Seems awfully cozy in there for a man living alone." Sterling's suspicion hardened into certainty. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, through charm, money, or force. "I have a strong feeling you're not telling me the truth, old man," he said, his voice losing its mocking edge and taking on a dangerous bite. He gestured to his 2 companions, who swung down from their saddles, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. "We'll just have a look inside. A matter of ranch business." Jedediah did not move an inch. He was rooted to the earth, a human extension of the mountain's own stubbornness. "This is my home," he stated, his voice low and final. "You are not welcome here." The pretense of civility shattered. "Get out of the way," Sterling snarled. One of his men, a burly man with a mean-looking scar on his cheek, lunged forward, trying to shove Jedediah aside. It was like trying to move a boulder. Jedediah didn't even seem to brace himself. He simply absorbed the man's momentum and, with a powerful twist of his torso, flung him backward. The man landed with a heavy thud in a deep snowdrift, gasping for air. The second man went for his gun, but he was too slow. Jedediah closed the distance in a single stride, his large hand clamping down on the man's wrist with crushing force. A sickening crack echoed in the cold air, and the man screamed, his pistol dropping uselessly into the snow. The fight was not the clean, stylized violence of a saloon brawl. It was brutal, primal, and desperate. Sterling, seeing his men so easily dispatched, pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his boot. He circled Jedediah, his movements snake-like. "You'll die protecting her, you damn fool," he hissed and lunged. Jedediah met the attack not with finesse, but with raw, overwhelming power. He took the knife slash on his forearm, a deliberate sacrifice to get inside Sterling's guard. He grunted as the blade bit deep, but his other hand shot out and seized Sterling by the throat. He lifted the smaller man clean off his feet, Sterling's legs kicking uselessly in the air, his face turning a dark red. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of pure terror. Jedediah's face was inches from his eyes burning with a cold, controlled rage. "She is not yours," he growled, the words seeming to come from the very depths of the mountain. He didn't choke him. He simply held him there for a terrifying moment, a demonstration of absolute power, before hurling him through the air. Sterling landed in a heap near his terrified, injured men. Jedediah stood over them, blood dripping from his arm onto the pure white snow, his chest heaving. "Get off my mountain," he commanded, his voice a promise of death. "And if you ever come back, I will bury you on it." Scrambling, dragging their wounded companion, they mounted their horses and fled, a panicked, disorderly retreat down the slope, leaving only bloodstains and silence in their wake. The rush of combat faded, leaving Jedediah with the sharp, throbbing pain in his forearm and the ragged sound of his own breathing. He leaned heavily against the log wall of his cabin, the strength that had surged through him moments before now draining away, leaving a profound weariness. The pristine snow around his home was now trampled and stained, a violation of his sanctuary. He heard a faint scraping sound from inside, and a moment later the trap door was pushed open. Leanne emerged from the darkness of the cellar, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with an emotion he couldn't quite name, a mixture of terror, relief, and something akin to awe. She took in the scene, the blood on the snow, the deep gash on his arm, the exhausted slump of his massive shoulders. Her gaze locked onto the wound, and her resolve hardened. Ripped a long, clean strip from it. The sound of a tearing fabric was loud in the sudden quiet. She gestured for him to come inside, her authority quiet but absolute. He followed her back into the warmth of the cabin, slumping onto a stool by the fire. She took a kettle from the hearth and poured warm water into a basin. Her movements were steady, her hands no longer trembling. She knelt before him and began to clean the wound. Her touch was impossibly gentle. He flinched as she cleaned the edges of the cut, the sting sharp, but he remained still under her care. He was a man who had stitched his own flesh, set his own broken bones, and endured pain in stoic silence his entire adult life. He was not used to being tended to. He was not used to this quiet, focused gentleness. He watched her, the firelight illuminating the strands of dark hair that had escaped her braid, the fierce concentration in her eyes. This was an intimacy deeper than any words they had exchanged. It was an act of profound care, a silent acknowledgement of the debt between them. He had protected her life, and now she was mending his body. When she was finished, she bound the wound tightly with the strip of white cloth, her small hands sure and competent. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of everything that had just happened. He could only nod, his throat tight. In that moment, the last of the ice around his heart finally broke. The cabin settled back into a deep quiet, but it was a different kind of silence now. The threat had passed, for the moment, but it lingered outside like a phantom, promising to return. They sat by the fire, the space between them filled with a new, unspoken connection forged in violence and sealed in care. The white bandage on his arm was a stark reminder of their shared ordeal. "They will be back," Leanne said, her voice soft but steady. She was no longer looking at him like a frightened victim. She was looking at him like a partner. "Sterling will not give up." Jedediah stared into the flames, the muscles in his jaw tight. "Why is he hunting you, Leanne? What does he want?" The time for secrets was over. She took a deep breath, gathering her strength, and began to speak. She told him of her late husband, a man named Marcus Thorne, who had been decades older than her. He had been a kind man, she explained, who had treated her with respect and affection, a stark contrast to the life of poverty she had known before. He had owned the Double Crown, the largest and most powerful ranch in the territory. When he died of a fever in the fall, he had left everything to her. The will was ironclad. The ranch, the cattle, the fortune, it was all hers. But Sterling, his ambitious and ruthless foreman, had seen her as a mere obstacle, a woman he could easily manipulate or dispose of. "He wanted to control the ranch," she said, her voice tinged with a bitter anger. "He proposed marriage first. He thought I would be a grateful, compliant little widow he could lock away while he ran everything. When I refused him, I saw the change in his eyes." Her voice dropped lower. "He became dangerous. He started spreading rumors that I was unfit, that my mind was addled with grief. He tried to isolate me from the loyal ranch hands. The trip I was on, it was his idea. A short ride to clear my head. He sent me out with a horse he knew had a weak leg, right before the biggest storm of the season. It was not an accident, Jedediah. He was trying to have me declared dead so he could seize control." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her voice was resolute. "I cannot hide up here forever. I have to go back. I have to face him and take back what is mine." Jedediah listened, his expression grim. He looked at her, this small, determined woman who had been thrown into a war she hadn't asked for. Then he looked around his cabin, at the quiet, solitary world he had built. It had been his fortress for so long, but he knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that it was no longer enough. Hiding was no longer living. The next morning dawned cold and bright. A decision had been made in the quiet hours of the night, a silent pact that needed no words. Jedediah packed a small satchel with dried meat, a water skin, and the whetstone for his knife. Leanne, dressed now in a pair of his own spare buckskin trousers and a shirt he had given her, ill-fitting but far more practical than her ruined dress, braided her long hair tightly. The cabin, which had been a refuge, now felt like a cage they were ready to leave. The journey down the mountain was the inverse of his desperate climb up. Then he had carried her as a fragile burden. Now they moved together, side by side. The path was treacherous, hidden beneath deep snow and slick with ice, but he guided her with a steady presence. When they came to a steep, icy decline, his large hand would find her elbow, his grip sure and solid, preventing a fall. When a drift was too deep, he would go first, his powerful legs creating a path for her to follow. These were practical gestures, born of necessity, but they carried a profound, unspoken tenderness. They moved through the silent, snow-laden forest, the only sounds the crunch of their footsteps and their shared breaths misting in the air. The harshness of the landscape was softened by their proximity, the shared purpose that propelled them forward. He had spent years walking these mountains alone, content in his isolation. Now, the presence of another being beside him did not feel like an intrusion. It felt right. It felt like coming home to a place he didn't know he had been missing. As they finally descended below the tree line, the vast, open expanse of the valley floor spread out before them like a map. In the distance, nestled against the foothills, lay the Double Crown Ranch. It was a sprawling complex of buildings, a grand main house, long barns, corrals, and countless smaller structures. It was a kingdom carved out of the wilderness, a symbol of the power and greed that had nearly cost Leanne her life. It looked formidable, an empire waiting to be reclaimed. Jedediah stopped, looking down at the challenge that lay before them. He expected to see fear or apprehension on Leanne's face, but when he turned to her, she was not looking at the ranch. She was looking at him, her dark eyes searching his. "Will you?" she began, her voice soft, the question hanging unfinished in the crisp air. She didn't need to say the rest. "Will you stay? Will you fight with me?" He met her gaze, and the world of solitude he had so carefully constructed crumbled away to nothing. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'm with you," he said. The words were simple, a vow spoken in the quiet of the wilderness, but they carried the weight of a new world. His life on the mountain was over. Her fight was no longer hers to face alone. They stood there for a long moment, on the threshold between the wild and the civilized, two solitary souls who had found each other in a storm, their shared gaze a promise of the future they would now build, or defend, together. Then, with a shared resolve, they started walking down into the valley.